Port Bramble had never seen a man like Captain Thaddeus Blackthorne. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with shoulders wide as a ship's bow, the retired pirate cut an imposing figure against the harbour's modest buildings. Children scattered when his shadow fell across their path. Shopkeepers nervously counted their coins twice when his massive frame darkened their doorways. The whispers followed him like faithful seagulls. Monster, brute, criminal. Words that bounced off his weathered exterior but lodged deep in his heart. Each evening, Thaddeus would sit alone on the edge of the pier, watching families stroll together while the setting sun painted the waters gold. His massive hands, once feared throughout the 7 seas, now simply held fishing line and mended nets in solitude. Behind that fearsome beard and those storm-grey eyes lived a different truth. Than the town believed, dawn broke over Port Bramble, as it always did, with seagulls crying and fishing boats creaking against their moorings. Captain Thaddeus Blackthorne was already awake, as he had been for hours. Sleep rarely claimed him for more than a few restless intervals. His massive frame barely fit the sturdy bed he'd built himself in the small cottage at the edge of the harbour. The morning routine never varied. He washed his weathered face in a basin of cold water, combed his fingers through his thick grey beard, and dressed in the same style of clothes he'd worn for decades: sturdy canvas trousers, a faded shirt that had once been white, and boots that had walked the decks of a dozen ships. Thaddeus kept his sea chest at the foot of his bed. Made of oak and bound with brass, it was the one possession he truly valued. Inside lay the remnants of his former life: navigation instruments, an old spyglass, a tattered logbook, and a small wooden carving of the first ship he'd ever captained. There was no gold, no jewels, none of the treasure townsfolk whispered about when they thought he couldn't hear. When Thaddeus walked through the market for his weekly supplies, conversations halted. Mothers pulled children closer. Shopkeepers watched his hands as if they might pocket merchandise, despite never once having stolen in the 3 years he'd lived in Port Bramble. "Morning," he'd rumble, his deep voice causing a young man to flinch as he approached the baker's stall. The baker, Mrs. Finch, slid his usual order across the counter, 2 loaves of brown bread, refusing to place them directly in his outstretched palm, as she did with other customers. Thaddeus counted out exact coins, careful that his fingers didn't brush against hers. "Thank you kindly," he said, tucking the bread into his satchel. A small boy, no more than 4, stared openly at him from behind his mother's skirts. When Thaddeus offered a small wave, the mother gasped and hurried away, whispering harshly to her child. Later that morning, away from judging eyes, Thaddeus sat on the eastern shore, mending fishing nets, with a skill and delicacy that would surprise anyone who believed his hands only knew violence. His fingers, though thick and scarred, worked the fine cord with precision. Nearby, a wounded seabird watched him warily as it pecked at the scraps of fish he'd left. Nearby, the same bird he'd splintered a broken wing for 2 weeks. Prior, the afternoon found him in his small workshop behind the cottage. Here, surrounded by tools and the scent of fresh-cut wood, Thaddeus crafted intricate model ships in bottles. None were ever sold or given away. He simply built them, admired them for a time, then released them to the sea during high tide, watching as his creations sailed toward the horizon that had once been his home. At sunset, when fishermen returned with their catches and families gathered for evening meals, Thaddeus would take his usual place at the end of the eastern pier. He'd watch the town light up window by window, imagining the conversations, the laughter, the simple joy of belonging that remained as elusive to him as the stars reflecting on the water's surface. Sometimes he would softly sing old sea shanties, his rich baritone carrying just far enough to make passers-by stop and listen, before hurrying away when they realized the source. Once darkness fully claimed the sky, Thaddeus would return to his empty cottage. He'd light a single candle, prepare a simple meal, and read from one of the few books he owned until sleep finally came. Each night before extinguishing the candle, he would open his sea chest once more. Beneath the navigational tools and logbooks lay a small, worn portrait of a woman whose eyes held the same storm-grey colour as his own. He would touch it briefly, then close the chest, locking away both treasures and memories until another solitary day dawned in Port Bramble. Port Bramble had stood as a humble fishing village for nearly 2 centuries, nestled in a natural harbour that offered protection from the worst of the Atlantic's moods. Generations of families had built their lives around the rhythms of the tides, the migrations of fish, and the changing of seasons. It was a place where everyone knew not just your name, but your parents' names and likely your grandparents as well. The harbour notice board stood at the centre of town life, its wooden surface weathered by salt air and decades of use. Announcements of births, deaths, weddings, and warnings about weather-shared space, with the daily catch reports and trade ship schedules. But for the past 3 years, a different sort of notice had regularly appeared. Warnings about the pirate, sketches of his imposing figure, and reminders to keep children away from the eastern pier. I heard he sank 12 merchant vessels before retiring, whispered Elias Green, the tavern owner, as he tacked up the latest notice warning of suspicious activity near the docks. 12. I heard it was 20, replied Samuel Porter, the town blacksmith. And they say he made the survivors walk the plank. Neither man had actually spoken to Thaddeus, Mayor Wilson. A third-generation Port Bramble resident with silver hair and a perpetual frown emerged from the town hall. Gentlemen, let's not spread tales we can't verify, but do remind your customers to secure their valuables at night. The mayor had led 3 closed council meetings about the pirate problem since spring. The most recent had concluded with a narrow vote against formally asking Thaddeus to leave, not out of kindness, but fear of reprisal. My sister in Portsmouth says they had a pirate try to settle there 10 years back, said Mrs. Finch, the baker, as she arranged fresh rolls in her window display. The town made it clear he wasn't welcome, and he left within a fortnight. We should do the same, agreed Mr. Parsons, the elderly harbour master. Been nothing but unease since he arrived. Fish catches are down too. You can't blame poor fishing on the man, said Dr. Adams, the town's physician, and one of the few who'd voted against pressuring Thaddeus to leave. And I've never seen him cause actual trouble. Because we keep our distance, Mrs. Finch snapped. My Herbert says he's seen him watching the children play from that workshop of his. Not natural for a man his age to be so interested in little ones. Dr. Adams sighed, but didn't argue further. It was an old conversation repeated weekly across Port Bramble, in the market, at the tavern, after Sunday services. On the other side of town, schoolteacher Miss Winters gathered her young students in the small schoolhouse. Remember? Children, stay away from the eastern shore. It's not safe, she instructed as they prepared to leave for the day. Go straight home. Is it because of the giant pirate? Asked young Thomas Finch, the baker's son. He's not really a giant, corrected 10-year-old James Porter. My father says he's just a very large man. He's still dangerous, Miss Winters interjected. They say he once commanded a crew of 50 cutthroats. Now, off you go, straight home. As the children scattered, they passed Reverend Collins posting a notice about Sunday's sermon on the harbour board. The children didn't see him pause to read the latest warning about Thaddeus before quietly removing it and placing his sermon announcement over the spot. Judge not, lest ye be judged, he murmured to himself, looking toward the distant figure of Thaddeus working on the docks. The whispers continued into evening as fishermen returned with their catches, as families gathered for meals, as the tavern filled with the day's end conversations. Port Bramble was a town built on fish and timber, but it ran on whispers, assumptions, and fear of the unknown, and at the edge of it all sat Thaddeus, separate and surrounded by a wall not of his own making. Clara Marshall sat cross-legged in her favourite hideaway, a small alcove formed by 2 large rocks near the south end of the beach. Here she was hidden from view, but could see everything: the harbour, the fishing boats, and most importantly, the eastern pier, where the mysterious Captain Blackthorne often sat. Her small hands moved deftly across the page of her sketchbook, adding details to a drawing of a magnificent ship with billowing sails. Unlike the crude stick figures most 8-year-olds produced, Clara's drawings showed remarkable attention to detail, from the rigging of the sails to the tiny figures of sailors climbing the masts. "Clara!" Her mother's voice called from the direction of their cottage. "It's nearly supper time!" Reluctantly, Clara closed her sketchbook, a prized possession with its leather cover worn soft from constant handling. Inside were dozens of drawings, ships of all sizes, sea creatures real and imagined, and several sketches of a particular large figure sitting alone on the pier. "Coming, Mother," she called back, tucking the sketchbook into her satchel. Hannah Marshall was stirring a pot of fish stew when Clara entered their small cottage overlooking the southern harbour. Though only 32, Hannah's face carried the weariness of someone who had faced more than her share of life's hardships. "Hands washed?" she asked without looking up. "Yes, Mother," Clara replied, showing her clean palms as proof. "Were you down by the water again?" Hannah asked, her voice carrying that familiar edge of concern. "I was drawing," Clara answered truthfully, if incompletely. Hannah sighed, ladling stew into 2 bowls. "You know you're not to go near the eastern shore." "It's not safe," Clara finished. "I know. I stayed by the South Rocks." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Clara spoke again. "Mother, why is everyone afraid of Captain Blackthorne?" Hannah's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "Clara, we've discussed this. He's a dangerous man with a dark past. But how do you know? Has he ever hurt anyone in Port Bramble?" "It's not that simple, dear," Hannah replied, her eyes drifting to the portrait hanging above their small fireplace, a painting of a handsome man in a merchant navy uniform. "Clara's father lost at sea 3 years ago. Sometimes you can tell a person is dangerous before they do dangerous things. Later, as Hannah mended clothes by candlelight, Clara sat at the table with her sketchbook open again, adding colour to her latest drawing with the set of watercolours she'd received last Christmas. "What are you working on now?" Hannah asked, glancing over. Clara turned the book to show a colourful rendering of a birthday party, her upcoming 9th birthday, just 2 weeks away. "It's lovely," Hannah smiled. "Are you excited about your party?" Clara nodded enthusiastically. "Will Father be back by then?" Hannah's hand stilled. "Clara, we've talked about this." "Your father? He's not coming back. But the other sailors said some men get rescued after being shipwrecked. They get found on islands years later." Hannah set aside her mending and moved to kneel beside her daughter. "That's very, very rare, sweetheart. And it's been 3 years now." Clara looked down at her drawing. "I still think about him every day." "So do I," Hannah whispered, stroking Clara's auburn hair, the same shade as her father's had been. The next morning, after her lessons with Miss Winters, Clara returned to her hiding spot with her sketchbook. Today, Captain Blackthorne was on the pier earlier than usual, working with fishing nets. Clara watched his large hands move with surprising gentleness as he repaired the delicate netting. She opened to a fresh page and began to sketch, capturing the contrast between his massive frame and the delicate work. She had never been as afraid of him as the others, perhaps because she had seen him when others hadn't, feeding seagulls, releasing tiny model ships at dawn, helping an old fisherman whose boat had drifted too far from the dock. These were not the actions of a monster. As Clara added shading to her drawing, a bold thought formed in her mind. Her birthday was coming, and everyone deserved to be invited to a party sometime, even giant pirates that everyone else feared. The kitchen table in the Marshall cottage was covered with coloured paper, ribbons, and Clara's art supplies. Hannah watched her daughter carefully cut a square of blue paper, fold it precisely, and begin decorating it with drawings of seashells and tiny ships. "These invitations are beautiful." "Clara," Hannah said, admiring the careful detail, "Mrs. Finch will be impressed when Thomas receives his." Clara beamed at the praise. "I'm making one for everyone in my class, and Miss Winters and Dr. Adams because he gave me medicine when I had that bad cough, and Reverend Collins because he always gives me peppermints after church." Hannah counted the completed invitations arranged in a neat row. "That's 13. How many more do you plan to make? Clara bit her lower lip, a habit when she was contemplating something important. Just one more. For who? I thought we'd invited all your friends. Clara concentrated on her cutting, not meeting her mother's eyes. It's for Captain Blackthorne. The wooden spoon Hannah had been using to stir preserves clattered to the floor. Clara, you cannot be serious. Why not? He's always alone. No one ever invites him to anything. There's good reason for that, Hannah said, retrieving the spoon and wiping it clean. He's not someone you should be around. But he's never been mean to anyone, Clara protested. Not once since he came here. And he looks sad when he thinks no one's watching. Hannah sighed, sitting down beside her daughter. Clara, kindness is a wonderful quality, but sometimes being too trusting can be dangerous. We don't know anything about that man, except that he was once a pirate. Daddy said not all pirates were bad, Clara counted. Some were just sailors who couldn't find other work. Hannah closed her eyes briefly at the mention of her husband. Your father was an optimist who always saw the best in people, and you always said that's what you loved most about him. Hannah couldn't argue with that. She looked at her daughter's earnest face and recognized the same stubborn determination that had made her fall in love with James Marshall years ago. I'll think about it, she finally said, knowing already what Clara would do regardless of her answer. The next morning, after her mother left for her work at the seamstress shop, Clara carefully placed the special invitation in her satchel. She had stayed up late finishing it, adding extra details and even a tiny portrait of the captain himself, standing tall and smiling instead of frowning as he usually did. Clara's heart pounded as she made her way to the eastern pier. She had never actually spoken to the captain before, only observed him from a distance. Up close, he was even more imposing than she had imagined. Sitting on his usual spot at the pier's edge, his legs dangling above the water, he looked like a giant from her storybooks. She approached quietly, clutching the invitation tightly in her small hand. When she was just a few feet away, Captain Blackthorne turned suddenly, sensing her presence. His thick eyebrows rose in surprise. Children never approached him voluntarily. "Hello, Captain," Clara said, her voice small but steady. Thaddeus blinked in confusion. "Hello," he responded, his deep voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid speaking normally might frighten her away. "I'm Clara Marshall." She extended her hand formally, the way her father had taught her to greet adults. After a moment's hesitation, Thaddeus gently took her tiny hand in his massive one, engulfing it completely. "Thaddeus Blackthorne," he replied, though he suspected she already knew his name. "I know," Clara smiled. "I've drawn you in my sketchbook. You're very interesting to draw because you're so big and have such a nice beard." A startled sound escaped him, something between a cough and a chuckle. "Thank you, I think." Clara thrust the blue invitation toward him. "I'm having my 9th birthday party next Saturday at 2:00. There will be cake and games, and everyone is bringing presents. But you don't have to if you don't want to. I'd just like it if you came." Thaddeus stared at the handmade card as if it were made of gold. With reverent care, he accepted it, opening it to reveal Clara's artwork inside and the carefully printed details. "You're inviting me?" he asked, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. "Yes," Clara said simply. "Everyone should be invited to a party sometimes." Thaddeus sat at his workbench, the blue invitation propped carefully against a lantern where he could see it. 3 days had passed since the little girl, Clara, had handed it to him, and still he found himself staring at it in disbelief. His large fingers traced the childish drawing on the front, a crude but recognizable rendering of himself, standing tall with what appeared to be a smile hidden in his beard. No one had drawn him smiling in decades. What does one bring to a child's birthday? He muttered to himself, a habit from years of solitude. The question had consumed him since receiving the invitation. He had crafted dozens of beautiful objects over the years, model ships, carved figurines, intricate wooden puzzles, but none had been made as gifts. None had been made to please another person. Thaddeus pulled open a drawer, filled with sketches and designs. Among them was an old, yellowed piece of parchment, a treasure map from his sailing days, marked with ink that had faded to a soft sepia. Not a map to buried gold, as legends suggested, but to hidden freshwater springs on remote islands, far more valuable to a sailor than any chest of coins. He spread the map on his table, running his fingers over the familiar contours. It had saved his crew more than once. Now it would serve a different purpose. In his workshop, Thaddeus selected the finest piece of cherrywood he had been saving for a special project. With practiced precision, he began to shape it, his massive hands surprisingly delicate as they worked the wood. For 2 days, he carved during every free moment, through the night by lantern light. At dawn, as the sun rose over the harbour, word of Clara's invitation spread through Port Bramble like wildfire. She did what? Mrs. Finch exclaimed when she heard the news from her son Thomas, who had witnessed the invitation being delivered. Hannah must be beside herself. By midday, Hannah Marshall found herself surrounded by concerned mothers outside the seamstress shop where she worked. "You can't possibly allow that man in your home," insisted Mrs. Porter. "The blacksmith's wife. My Thomas will not attend if that pirate is there," added Mrs. Finch. Hannah sighed, setting aside the dress she was mending. "Clara has a kind heart. She believes everyone deserves a chance. Children don't understand danger," Mrs. Porter pressed. "That's why parents must protect them." Hannah looked out the window toward the eastern pier, where she could just make out the large figure of Captain Blackthorne. "I haven't given my permission yet," she said quietly. "But Clara is much like her father. Once she believes something is right, she's difficult to dissuade." Later that evening, as Clara arranged her birthday dress on a chair for the coming Saturday, Hannah approached her daughter's bedroom. "Clara, about the captain's invitation." "He has a name, Mother," Clara said without looking up. "Captain Thaddeus." Hannah sat on the edge of the bed. "Yes, Captain Thaddeus. Several parents have expressed concern about him attending your party." "Because they think he's dangerous," Clara stated matter-of-factly. "But they're wrong. How can you be so certain?" Clara opened her sketchbook, flipping to several drawings of the captain. "I've watched him. He's gentle with animals. He helps old Mr. Jenkins with his boat when he thinks no one is looking. And he saved a baby bird with a broken wing." Hannah studied her daughter's drawings, seeing the captain through Clara's eyes, not as a fearsome pirate, but as a solitary figure performing small kindnesses when he thought no one was watching. "If he comes," Hannah said slowly, "he must understand there will be rules. He can't stay too long, and he must be on his best behavior." Clara's face lit up. "So he can come?" "If he chooses to," Hannah replied, still uncertain she was making the right decision. Meanwhile, Thaddeus carefully sanded the edges of his creation, buffing the wood until it gleamed warmly in the lamplight. Beside his workbench lay the old treasure map, now repurposed as wrapping paper for Clara's gift. He glanced again at the blue invitation. Never in his years in Port Bramble had anyone invited him into their home. The prospect was as terrifying as any storm he'd faced at sea, and perhaps more important than any treasure he'd sought in his younger days. Saturday dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of salt and summer flowers across Port Bramble. Thaddeus woke earlier than usual, though he had barely slept. The blue invitation sat on his bedside table, the first thing he saw each morning, and the last thing he looked at before attempting sleep. He moved to the old sea chest and opened it reverently. From beneath his navigation tools and logbooks, he removed a carefully folded garment he hadn't worn in years, his best coat. Made of deep navy wool with modest brass buttons, it had been reserved for meetings with merchants and officials during his sailing days. Thaddeus laid it on the bed, inspecting it for moth holes or wear. Finding it reasonably intact, he took up a needle and thread to repair a loose button and strengthen a weakened seam. After washing thoroughly in the basin, he trimmed his beard with unusual care and attempted to tame his wild grey hair with a comb and water. The man who looked back at him from the small mirror above his washstand seemed a stranger, less weathered, Somehow, with anticipation softening his usually stern expression, the coat fit more snugly than it once had, stretching across shoulders broadened by years of physical labor. But it would do. He adjusted the collar, straightened his cleanest white shirt beneath it, and took a deep breath. On his workbench, Clara's gift waited, wrapped in the old treasure map and tied with twine. He had worked until midnight putting the finishing touches on it, ensuring every detail was perfect. The town square was unusually crowded for a Saturday morning. Thaddeus felt eyes following him as he made his way through with the package tucked carefully under one arm. Whispers followed in his wake. "He's actually going. Hannah must be mad to allow it. Look at him all dressed up like he belongs at a child's party." Thaddeus kept his gaze forward, his face impassive despite the burning in his chest. For Clara, he would endure far worse than whispers. Meanwhile, Clara's cottage bustled with activity. Hannah arranged plates of small cakes and sandwiches, while Clara hung paper decorations she had made herself, ships and seagulls and starfish dangling from strings. "Do you think he'll really come?" Clara asked for the third time that hour, peering out the window toward the path from town. "I don't know, dear," Hannah replied honestly. "It would be very different for him, being around so many people who don't know him," Clara finished. "But they might like him, if they gave him a chance." Hannah smiled sadly at her daughter's optimism. "Just remember, if he does come, some of the other children might be frightened. You'll need to help everyone feel comfortable." "I will," Clara promised solemnly. By 1:30, the first guests began to arrive. Thomas Finch and his mother came with a small wrapped package, followed by the Porter family, then several of Clara's schoolmates with their parents. Each child greeted Clara enthusiastically, while the adults spoke in hushed tones, glancing occasionally toward the window. "Is it true?" Mrs. Finch whispered to Hannah in the kitchen. "You're actually allowing that man to attend." "Clara invited him," Hannah said simply, arranging candles on the birthday cake. "And I've never taught her to exclude people." "There's a difference between inclusion and recklessness," Mrs. Finch insisted. "My Thomas is terrified." Outside, the children had begun a game of tag in the small garden, their laughter carrying through the open windows. Clara kept glancing toward the path from town, her smile faltering slightly each time she saw it empty. Just as Hannah was about to call everyone in for cake, Clara let out a gasp. There, approaching slowly along the path, was the unmistakable figure of Captain Blackthorne. He had combed his beard and wore a formal coat that must have been quite impressive in its day. In his arms, he carried a package wrapped in what appeared to be an old map. "He came," Clara whispered, her face lighting up with delight. "He really came!" The children's game halted abruptly as they too noticed the approaching giant. Parents moved protectively closer to their offspring, and a tense silence fell over the gathering. Captain Thaddeus Blackthorne stopped at the garden gate, suddenly aware of all the eyes fixed upon him. His confidence wavered as he took in the scene. Families clustered together, children half hidden behind adults, faces ranging from curious to openly hostile. For a moment, he considered turning back. Then Clara broke from the group, running toward him with a smile that outshone the summer sun. "Captain Thaddeus, you came." Clara took Thaddeus's massive hand in her small one, apparently untroubled by the stark contrast. "Come meet everyone," she said, tugging him toward the gathering. Thaddeus ducked his head instinctively as he passed through the garden gate, though it was plenty tall enough. Old habits from a lifetime of doorways too small for his frame. Hannah Marshall stepped forward, her expression a careful mask of politeness. "Captain Blackthorne, welcome to our home." "Thank you kindly for having me, Mrs. Marshall," he replied, his deep voice uncommonly soft. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all. Clara has been watching the path for you." Hannah gestured toward the other guests, who remained clustered together, watching warily. "You know most of the townspeople, I believe." Thaddeus nodded respectfully toward the group, but made no move to approach them. Instead, he turned to Clara. "I brought you something," he said, offering the package wrapped in the old map. You didn't have to bring a present, Clara said, though her eyes shone with excitement. It's a birthday, Thaddeus replied simply. There should be presents. As Clara carefully unwrapped the package, the other children, curiosity overcoming fear, edged closer to see. Even some of the adults leaned forward despite themselves. Inside was a wooden ship, nearly 2 feet long, carved with extraordinary detail. Tiny railings ran along the deck, minuscule rigging held aloft miniature sails, and a tiny wheel actually turned the rudder. Most remarkably, the entire vessel sat atop a mechanism that, when wound with a small key, gently rocked the ship as if it were sailing on invisible waves. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, Clara breathed, turning the key to watch the ship rock. Did you make this yourself? Thaddeus nodded, a hint of color rising to his weathered cheeks. Been working on similar designs for years, never had a reason to finish one properly until now. The other children crowded around Clara, their fear momentarily forgotten. Can I touch it? Asked Thomas Finch. Does it really sail? James Porter wanted to know. It's not for water, Thaddeus explained, but it sails on dreams well enough. Mrs. Finch, watching from the sidelines, whispered to Hannah, I had no idea he was so. Inside the cottage, Hannah invited everyone for cake and refreshments. The magnificent birthday cake held center stage on the table, an ocean blue creation decorated with white frosting waves and tiny sugar seashells. 9 candles stood ready to be lit. Thaddeus hesitated at the door, uncertain whether to follow inside. The cottage was modest but cozy, with maritime touches that spoke of the family's connection to the seashells on the mantelpiece, a ship in a bottle on a shelf, and a portrait of a man in a merchant navy uniform who must have been Clara's father. Please come in, Captain, Hannah said, noticing his hesitation. Though you may need to mind your head. The children found this comment inexplicably hilarious, breaking some of the tension as Thaddeus carefully made his way inside, indeed having to duck beneath doorways and light fixtures. As everyone gathered around the table, a problem became apparent. There was no chair suitable for Thaddeus's massive frame. Before anyone could comment, he solved the issue by comfortably sitting cross-legged on the floor, bringing him closer to the children's height. Clara beamed at him from her place of honor at the head of the table. Hannah lit the candles one by one, while everyone sang happy birthday. Everyone except Thaddeus, who mouthed the words silently, his deep voice remaining unheard. Make a wish, Hannah instructed when the song ended. Clara closed her eyes tightly for a moment, then opened them and blew out all 9 candles in one determined breath. The children applauded while Hannah began cutting the cake. What did you wish for? Thomas Finch asked Clara. I can't tell, or it won't come true, she replied with the wisdom of childhood. But her eyes darted briefly to Thaddeus, then to the other children, and back again. As Hannah served cake, Thaddeus surprised everyone by quietly asking if he could help. Soon, his large hands were carefully passing plates of cake and cups of punch, with unexpected grace. Have you always made ships, Captain? Clara asked as they all enjoyed the sweet treats. Since I was not much older than you, he replied. My father taught me to carve when I was 10. Were you always so tall? James Porter blurted out, earning a sharp look from his mother. Thaddeus's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, the closest thing to a smile most had ever seen from him. I was the tallest boy in my village. By 14, I was taller than my father, made me useful on ships, being able to reach the highest rigging without climbing. After cake and presents, the children spilled back into the garden to play. Clara proudly displayed her gifts on a small table by the window, a new dress from her mother, books from the school teacher, a pretty hair ribbon from Mrs. Finch, and various toys and trinkets from her classmates. But it was the wooden ship from Captain Blackthorne that drew everyone's attention, its delicate craftsmanship unlike anything the children had seen before. Thaddeus remained inside, helping Hannah clear away plates and cups with careful precision. His enormous hands dwarfed the delicate china, yet he handled each piece with remarkable gentleness. "You're very good with your hands, Captain," Hannah observed as she wrapped leftover cake. "Had to be," he replied simply. "Big hands break things if they're not careful." Hannah studied him for a moment. "Clara says you saved a bird with a broken wing." A hint of surprise crossed his weathered face. She saw that, the little wren by the eastern shore, wing was caught in some fishing line. "She sees more than most give her credit for," Hannah said quietly. Outside, Clara's voice rose above the others. "Captain Thaddeus, would you come out, please?" He glanced at Hannah, who nodded her permission. Making his way outside, Thaddeus found himself surrounded by children sitting in a semicircle on the grass. Clara patted the ground beside her. "Will you tell us a story, Captain? A real one about sailing?" The other adults exchanged wary glances, clearly concerned about what tales a former pirate might share with impressionable children. "I don't know any stories fit for little ears," Thaddeus demurred. "Please?" Clara pressed. "My father used to tell me stories about the sea before he—" She trailed off, her eyes dropping to her hands. Thaddeus settled his large frame carefully on the grass. From his pocket, he withdrew a large conch shell, its surface polished to a pearly sheen by years of handling. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, holding it up. "A conch shell," answered Thomas Finch promptly. "Not just any conch," Thaddeus corrected. "This is a storyteller's shell. When you hold it to your ear, it doesn't just whisper the sound of the ocean. It whispers stories that have never been told on land." He held the shell to his ear, his expression growing serious, as if listening intently. The children leaned forward, captivated. "This one's about a blue whale named Solomon who helped a lost ship find its way home during the worst storm in 100 years, he said finally, lowering the shell. "How did he do that?" asked Clara. Thaddeus cleared his throat, his deep voice dropping to an almost musical rumble. "Solomon was the oldest whale in the Pacific Ocean. He'd lived for nearly a century, which is very old even for a blue whale. He'd seen ships of every kind, tall ships with billowing sails, steamships belching smoke, modern vessels with engines louder than thunder." The children settled more comfortably, drawn into the tale. Even some of the parents edged closer to listen. Solomon knew every current, every hidden reef, every safe harbor, from Alaska to New Zealand. And whales, you see, can sense storms long before they arrive. Thaddeus's massive hands moved expressively as he spoke, painting pictures in the air of mountainous waves and howling winds. He described the young captain struggling to keep his vessel afloat after losing his navigation instruments, the frightened crew, and the mysterious appearance of Solomon alongside their ship. The whale didn't speak, of course, but he swam alongside the ship, always moving in one direction, no matter how the captain tried to turn away. Finally, desperate and with no better option, the captain decided to follow the whale's path. The children were utterly silent now, hanging on every word. Even Mrs. Finch had stopped whispering to Mrs. Porter to listen. For 3 days and 3 nights, through waves taller than this cottage, the ship followed Solomon. The crew thought their captain had gone mad from fear, but on the morning of the 4th day, the storm clouds parted just enough for them to see land ahead, a protected harbor they would never have found on their own. Did they ever see Solomon again? Clara asked when he paused. Thaddeus smiled slightly beneath his beard. Just once, as they sailed safely into harbor, the great whale breached beside their ship, rising so high that for a moment it seemed he would touch the sun itself. Then he was gone, back to the deep ocean, where ancient creatures keep their secrets. As he finished, Thaddeus looked up to find not just the children, but all the adults watching him, with expressions ranging from surprise to reluctant admiration. "Another one," cried James Porter. "Please, Captain, tell us another." As Thaddeus began his 3rd story, this one about a pod of dolphins that guided a small fishing boat through a dangerous reef. Mr. Parsons, the elderly harbor master, appeared at the garden gate. His weathered face was creased with concern. "Pardon the interruption," he called, touching the brim of his cap in greeting. "Just wanted to let folks know we're seeing signs of weather coming in. Might want to head home before sunset." Hannah looked toward the horizon where clouds were indeed gathering, though they seemed distant enough. "Is it serious, Mr. Parsons?" "Barometer's dropping faster than I've seen in years," the old man replied, producing a small brass weather glass from his pocket. The mercury within had sunk alarmingly low. "Harbor office sent word to any ships nearby to seek port elsewhere. We're battening down as best we can." The parents began gathering their children and collecting belongings, the pleasant atmosphere of the party giving way to murmurs of concern. Thaddeus rose from his storytelling position, his eyes fixed on the horizon with a look of deep concentration. "May I?" he asked Mr. Parsons, extending his hand toward the barometer. The harbour master hesitated before reluctantly handing it over. Thaddeus studied it, then turned his attention back to the distant clouds, noting their color and formation with narrowed eyes. "This isn't right," he said quietly. "What isn't right?" Hannah asked, standing beside him. "Those clouds are moving too fast and the wrong direction for this time of year." Thaddeus handed the weather glass back to Mr. Parsons. "When did you last check the tide chart?" "This morning," the harbour master replied stiffly, clearly offended by the implication he might have missed something. "High tide's not until tomorrow noon." Thaddeus shook his head. "With a storm like this bearing down, you'll see surge tides. The harbour walls won't hold if they're coming from the northeast." "And how would you know that?" Mr. Parsons challenged. "Sailed these waters for 30 years, Thaddeus replied evenly. "Seen 3 hurricanes and dozens of nor'easters. This has the makings of something worse." The two men stared at each other, decades of maritime experience silently measured between them. Finally, Mr. Parsons huffed. "I'll take your concerns under advisement, Captain. But I've been harbour master here for 22 years without incident." As the old man departed, Clara tugged at Thaddeus's sleeve. "Is there really going to be a bad storm?" Thaddeus knelt to her level, his face grave but gentle. "The sea is always honest, Clara. Even when men aren't. It tells us its intentions if we know how to listen." The party dispersed quickly after that, parents hurrying children home with anxious glances at the darkening sky. Hannah began bringing Clara's gifts inside as thunder rumbled in the distance. "You believe there's danger coming?" she said to Thaddeus. "It wasn't a question. I do." He looked down at Clara, who was carefully carrying her wooden ship indoors. "You should board up your windows, especially those facing the harbour, and move anything valuable to higher shelves." "The harbour walls have always protected us," Hannah replied, though uncertainty tinged her voice. "Not against a storm surge from the northeast," Thaddeus countered. "Your cottage sits lower than most." Hannah studied him for a moment. "You're truly concerned." "I am." His gaze returned to the horizon. "I should speak with the mayor. There are preparations that should begin immediately." "Mayor Wilson. He's not likely to listen to." Hannah stopped herself. "To a pirate," Thaddeus finished for her. "No, he's not. But I have to try." As Thaddeus prepared to leave, Clara ran to him, the conch shell in her hands. "You forgot your storytelling shell." He smiled beneath his beard. "Keep it safe for me. Perhaps I can tell you the rest of the dolphin story another day." Clara clutched the shell to her chest, beaming. "Promise?" "I promise," he replied solemnly. Hannah watched as Thaddeus made his way down the path toward town, his large figure silhouetted against the increasingly threatening sky. For the first time she saw not a fearsome pirate, but a man of wisdom trying to protect the community that had never accepted him. In town, Mayor Wilson was emerging from the council building when Thaddeus approached. The mayor's expression hardened immediately. "Captain Blackthorne," he acknowledged coldly. "I've heard you were at a children's gathering today. I trust there were no incidents." "The only incident coming is the storm," Thaddeus replied, pointing to the harbour. "Your weather glass is showing dangerous pressure drops. The cloud formations indicate a northeastern approach. Port Bramble needs to prepare for flooding." Mayor Wilson's eyes narrowed. Mr. Parsons has already informed me of normal precautions being taken. The harbor walls have protected us for over a century. Not from this, Thaddeus insisted. You need to evacuate the lower town, secure the boats differently. That's quite enough, the mayor interrupted. We don't need sailing stories frightening the townsfolk. Good day, Captain. Darkness fell upon Port Bramble with unnatural swiftness. The storm clouds, which had appeared as distant smudges during Clara's party, now loomed directly overhead, swollen with rain and crackling with lightning. The wind, which had been merely brisk in the afternoon, now howled through the narrow streets, rattling shutters and stripping leaves from trees. In his cottage, Thaddeus worked quickly, securing his few valuables in the sea chest and moving it to the highest shelf. Through his window, he could see fishing boats still bobbing in the harbor, secured with standard moorings that would never hold against the coming surge. Most troubling was the collection of small craft tied up along the eastern pier, directly in the path of the coming northeastern gale. A sudden violent gust shook his cottage, making the sturdy timbers creak in protest. Thaddeus grabbed his oilskin coat and headed for the door. If the officials wouldn't listen, he would do what he could alone. The first massive raindrop struck his face as he stepped outside, cold and stinging, propelled by wind already strong enough to make walking difficult. Leaning into the gale, Thaddeus made his way toward the harbor, where a few fishermen struggled to add extra lines to their boat. The standard moorings won't hold, he called to the closest man, young Peter Jenkins, whose father had taught him to sail. You need to angle the bow northeast and use crossing lines. The young fisherman looked up in surprise, rain streaming down his face. That's not how my father taught me. Your father never saw a storm like this coming from this direction, Thaddeus replied, already moving to demonstrate. His huge hands worked with practiced efficiency, adjusting the moorings to better distribute the strain from the direction the surge would come. Reluctantly, Peter began to help. Two other fishermen, seeing their work, approached cautiously. He's right, one of them admitted grudgingly, eyeing the sky. I've never seen clouds move in like this. Together, the small group reworked the moorings for half a dozen boats before the town bell began to ring. Not the measured toll marking the hour, but the rapid, urgent clanging of alarm. Thaddeus looked up to see Mayor Wilson and Mr. Parsons hurrying toward the harbor, faces grim. Emergency council meeting, the mayor announced to the gathered fishermen, pointedly ignoring Thaddeus. All residents should secure their properties and gather at the town hall immediately. What about the boats? Peter asked, gesturing to the many vessels still vulnerable in the harbor. Standard storm protocols, Mr. Parsons replied. We've weathered gales before. Thaddeus stepped forward, impossible to ignore with his towering height. This isn't a standard gale. The surge will come from the northeast, over the harbor wall. These boats need to be moved to the western inlet or secured differently. Mayor Wilson's face hardened. Captain Blackthorne, while we appreciate your concern, Port Bramble has established emergency procedure. A deafening crack of thunder punctuated his words, followed immediately by a bolt of lightning that struck the water just beyond the harbor wall. The assembled men jumped back involuntarily. There's no time for meetings, Thaddeus insisted, raising his voice above the strengthening wind. The water's already rising faster than normal tide patterns would allow. As if to confirm his warning, a massive wave crashed over the harbor wall, sending spray 30 feet into the air and washing across the pier where they stood. Mayor Wilson staggered back, suddenly looking less certain. Ring the emergency bell, he ordered Mr. Parsons. Evacuate the lower town. As the harbor master hurried to comply, the mayor turned reluctantly to Thaddeus. What do you suggest, Captain? Before Thaddeus could answer, another wave crashed over the wall, larger than the first. The men on the pier scrambled back toward higher ground. From all directions, townsfolk were emerging from their homes, faces pale with fear. Get everyone to the town hall, Thaddeus directed. It's on high ground with a stone foundation. Bring food, water, blankets, anything you can carry quickly. The mayor hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Do it," he told the gathered men, then to Thaddeus. "The boats." "I'll do what I can," Thaddeus promised, already turning back toward the pier where the smaller craft were beginning to strain at their moorings. As the town bell continued its frantic warning, families poured from their homes, children cried, parents called out names, and the elderly were helped along by neighbors. The ordered evacuation the mayor had envisioned quickly became chaotic, as another crash of thunder sent people running in panic. Through the confusion, Thaddeus worked steadily, moving from boat to boat, securing what could be saved. Rain lashed his face, and wind threatened to topple even his massive frame, but his hands remained sure, his mind calm, amidst the growing chaos. From the path leading down to the harbor, a small figure appeared, struggling against the wind. Thaddeus squinted through the driving rain to see Clara, clutching her wooden ship to her chest, searching the crowd with frightened eyes. Thaddeus abandoned the boats and rushed toward Clara, his massive strides covering ground quickly despite the howling wind and pelting rain. "What are you doing here?" he shouted over the storm, kneeling to her level. "Where is your mother?" "She went to help Miss Winters," Clara explained, her voice thin against the gale. "The schoolhouse roof started leaking. I was supposed to go straight to town hall, but I wanted to make sure you were safe." Without hesitation, Thaddeus lifted Clara onto his shoulders, where she clung tightly, still clutching her wooden ship. "Hold on," he instructed, turning toward higher ground. The main street leading to the town hall was already ankle-deep in swirling water. Rain continued to fall in blinding sheets, driven sideways by the fierce wind. Through the downpour, Thaddeus could see townspeople struggling uphill, helping the elderly and carrying children. "Look," Clara cried, pointing toward the lower town. Thaddeus turned to see water pouring between buildings from the direction of the harbor. The surge he'd feared was beginning, seawater flowing into the lowest-lying streets of Port Bramble. "The Porters live down there," Clara said anxiously, "and old Mr. Jenkins." Thaddeus hesitated only momentarily before changing course, heading toward the threatened area. As they approached, they could see the Porters, the blacksmith, his wife, and young James standing on their porch, surrounded by rising water that had already reached the bottom step. "Samuel," Thaddeus called, "get your family out now." The blacksmith looked up, startled to see the giant pirate with Clara perched on his shoulders. "The water came so fast," he shouted back. "We were gathering supplies when it started pouring in." "No time for supplies now," Thaddeus replied, wading toward them through water that was already mid-calf deep. The tides only beginning to surge, Mrs. Porter clutched her son tightly, eyeing the rising water with terror. Porter looked back at his home, his livelihood, then at his family. "Where to?" he asked Thaddeus. Decision made. "Town hall. It's on the highest ground." Thaddeus lowered Clara carefully, keeping her hand firmly in his. "Can you carry your boy?" Porter nodded, lifting James onto his back. Together the group began making their way uphill, fighting against wind and water. Other families joined them, fleeing homes that had stood secure for generations, but now faced nature's fury. At the end of the street, they encountered Dr. Adams, helping elderly Miss Jenkins, who was moving painfully slowly with his cane. The water's rising too fast. The doctor called to Thaddeus, "We need to move more quickly." Without discussion, Thaddeus handed Clara to Mrs. Porter and latted Mr. Jenkins into his arms as easily as if he were a child. "Lead on, doctor," he directed, falling into step behind him. By the time they reached the town hall, water was coursing down every street in Port Bramble. Inside the stone building, most of the town had gathered, wet, frightened and huddled in family groups. Mayor Wilson stood near the door, checking off names as people arrived. "The Porters, Dr. Adams, Mr. Jenkins," he noted, marking his list. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Thaddeus carrying the elderly man, but he said nothing as they entered. Hannah Marshall rushed forward as soon as they appeared, gathering Clara into her arms. "Thank God," she breathed. "When I got back and you weren't at the cottage, I was looking for Captain Thaddeus, Clara explained, still clutching her wooden ship, now somewhat worse for wear from the rain. Hannah looked up at the massive man who had just carefully set Mr. Jenkins on a bench. "Thank you," she said simply. Thaddeus nodded once, then turned back toward the door. "Where are you going?" Hannah asked, alarmed. "There are still people unaccounted for," Mayor Wilson answered, scanning his list. "The Finches haven't arrived, nor the Reverend. The bakery's in the lower town," Thaddeus said, "and the Reverend would be checking the church." "I've sent men to search," the mayor replied, "but the water's rising faster than—" A commotion at the door interrupted him, as a drenched Reverend Collins staggered in, supporting Mrs. Finch, who was weeping uncontrollably. "Thomas," she cried, "my Thomas is still out there." "Where?" Thaddeus demanded, moving toward them instantly. "He went back for the cat," Reverend Collins explained, his face grim. "I tried to stop him, but he slipped away. The water's up to the windowsills now." Without another word, Thaddeus pulled his oilskin coat tighter and moved toward the door. Mayor Wilson stepped in his path. "It's too dangerous," he said. "We've already sent 2 men to search, and they've had to turn back." Thaddeus looked down at the much smaller man. "The boy went back for a cat," he said quietly. "Would you have me do less for the boy?" The mayor hesitated, then stepped aside. "God go with you, Captain." Outside, the world had transformed. What had been streets were now canals of churning water. Rain still fell in torrents, and wind whipped debris through the air. Branches, shingles, fragments of wood. Thaddeus pulled from his pocket a small brass compass and sextant, tools of navigation that had guided him across treacherous oceans. Inside the town hall, Clara sat wrapped in a blanket beside her mother, watching anxiously as the massive doors occasionally opened to admit more sodden refugees from the storm. Each time, she hoped to see Thaddeus returning with young Thomas Finch, but each time her hopes were dashed. "Will they be all right, Mother?" she asked, clutching her wooden ship like a talisman. Hannah stroked her daughter's damp hair. "Captain Blackthorne knows what he's doing," she said, surprising herself with how much she believed it. "And Thomas is a clever boy." Across the room, Miss Finch sobbed quietly into a handkerchief, surrounded by sympathetic neighbors. Her husband had joined the search party against the mayor's advice, determined to find his son. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the windows facing the harbor. "The wall is breaching," someone shouted. People rushed to look out into the darkness, where lightning occasionally illuminated the scene. With each flash, they could see the harbor wall's sturdy stone that had protected Port Bramble for generations, beginning to crumble under the relentless pounding of the storm surge. "If that wall gives way completely, the entire lower town will be underwater," Dr. Adams warned. Mayor Wilson's face was grave. "And the water won't stop there. It could reach even the town hall if the surge is strong enough." The crowd murmured in fear. Children began to cry. The sanctuary they had thought secure suddenly felt fragile. "We need higher ground," Reverend Collins suggested. "The church bell tower." "There's no time to move everyone," the mayor interrupted, "and the path to the church would be underwater by now." Clara tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Captain Thaddeus doesn't know about the wall," she whispered urgently. Hannah's face paled as the implications hit her. "He's searching the lower town directly in the path of the flood." Before she could respond further, a massive crash reverberated through the night, felt even through the thick stone walls of the town hall. Lightning flashed again, revealing a section of the harbor wall collapsing into the churning sea. "It's giving way," someone shouted. In the chaos that followed, no one noticed Clara slipping away from her mother's side, still clutching her wooden ship. No one saw her edge toward the side door, normally used by the council members. No one realized she had disappeared until Hannah reached for her daughter's hand and found only empty air. "Clara?" Hannah looked around frantically. "Clara?" Outside, the world had become a nightmare landscape of wind, water, and darkness. Clara struggled against the gale, her small body nearly lifted off her feet by each powerful gust. The toy boat tucked under her arm caught the wind like a sail, making her stagger. "Captain Thaddeus," she called, her voice snatched away instantly by the howling storm. "The wall is breaking." Driven by instinct more than reason, Clara headed downhill toward the lower town, where she knew the captain would be searching for Thomas. Rain lashed her face, nearly blinding her. The water was already ankle-deep, even on the higher streets, flowing like a river down the slope. Inside the town hall, Hannah's cries had alerted others to Clara's disappearance. A search of the building proved fruitless. She must have gone after Captain Blackthorne, Hannah realized, her voice breaking. To warn him about the wall, Mayor Wilson immediately organized another search party, but as they prepared to leave, a second larger section of the harbor wall collapsed with a sound like thunder. Through the windows they could see a massive wave of water surge into the lower town, swallowing buildings up to their first floors in seconds. "My cottage," Hannah whispered, staring in horror. The Marshall home stood directly in the path of the onrushing flood. Unaware of the disaster unfolding behind her, Clara continued her determined journey downhill, each step becoming more difficult as the water rose and the current strengthened. She slipped once, falling to her knees, and her precious wooden ship was torn from her grasp by the rushing water. For a moment, she watched in dismay as it bobbed away into the darkness, but then she struggled back to her feet and pressed on. "Captain Thaddeus," she called again, more desperately. The water was now mid-calf, then knee-deep, its powerful current threatening to sweep her away with each step. Clara grabbed onto a lamppost, clinging to its cold metal as she tried to catch her breath and get her bearings in the darkness. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the street ahead, revealing a horrifying sight. A wall of water at least 6 feet high was rushing toward her, carrying debris from the destroyed harbor front. Clara screamed, but the sound was lost in the roar of the approaching deluge. On the far side of the lower town, Thaddeus had just located Thomas Finch, huddled with his cat in the relative safety of the bakery's second floor. As he prepared to carry the boy to safety, his keen ears caught a sound that froze his blood, a child's scream, barely audible above the storm's fury. "Clara?" he whispered, turning toward the sound. Through the driving rain, he could just make out a small figure, clinging to a lamppost as a massive surge of water raced toward her. "Go," he ordered Thomas, pointing toward the town hall visible on higher ground. "Run uphill as fast as you can. Don't stop for anything." Without waiting to see if the boy obeyed, Thaddeus plunged into the flood, fighting against the current with all his considerable strength, desperate to reach Clara before the wall of water did. Time seemed to slow as Thaddeus lunged through the churning water. His powerful legs drove against the current, his arms cutting through the flood with the practiced strokes of a lifelong sailor. The distance between him and Clara stretched like an endless sea, each yard gained through sheer force of will. The wall of water was approaching faster than he could move. Clara clung to the lamppost, her small face white with terror in the occasional flashes of lightning. She saw him coming and her lips moved, forming his name, though the sound was lost in the storm's fury. Thaddeus reached into his coat and pulled out a length of rope, a sailor's most essential tool, which he never traveled without. With practiced hands, he quickly fashioned a loop and cast it toward Clara, the heavy knot at the end, carrying it through the wind. "Grab it," he shouted, his deep voice barely carrying over the roar of water. "Put it around you." Clara released one hand from the lamppost to catch the rope, nearly losing her grip as she did. The loop fell around her shoulders, and she managed to pull it down to her waist just as the surge hit. The force of the water tore her from the lamppost as if she were made of straw. Clara screamed as she was swept away, but the rope pulled taut in Thaddeus's iron grip. He braced himself, feet wide apart, leaning back against the tremendous force. The rushing water lifted him off his feet, but he maintained his hold on the rope, allowing himself to be carried in the same direction as Clara. Using the current rather than fighting it, Thaddeus pulled himself along the rope toward the terrified child. "Hold on," he called as he reached her, wrapping one massive arm around her tiny form. "I've got you." Together they were swept down the flooded street, Thaddeus maneuvering them toward the side where buildings offered some protection from the main force of the current. He spotted a sturdy oak tree, its lower branches dipping into the floodwater, and steered them toward it. With a powerful lunge, he grabbed a branch, arresting their wild journey. Clara coughed and sputtered in his arms, but she was alive and conscious. "Captain," she gasped. The harbor wall broke. "I came to warn you." "I know," he replied gently, securing her more firmly in his grip. "Brave girl. Foolish, but brave." The water continued to rise, now chest-deep on Thaddeus. The tree would not remain a safe haven for long. "My mother," Clara said suddenly. "Our cottage. We'll find her," Thaddeus promised, though he had no idea how they would navigate through the flooded town to the safety of higher ground. Looking around, Thaddeus assessed their options. The main street had become a raging river, but between the buildings the water flowed less violently. If they could move from structure to structure, using each as a shield against the current. "Listen carefully," he told Clara. "We're going to move from one safe spot to another. When I say hold your breath, do it immediately. Understand?" Clara nodded solemnly. Thaddeus unwound the rope from around her waist and quickly fashioned a secure harness, tying her to himself so she couldn't be swept away. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," she replied, her small voice steady, despite her obvious fear. They moved from the tree to the awning of a shop, then to a garden wall, then to the stone steps of the cobblers. Each transition required careful timing and all of Thaddeus's considerable strength. Sometimes they were fully submerged, with Clara drawing her breath as instructed, trusting Thaddeus completely. From the cobbler's steps, they could see the Marshall cottage. The water had risen to its windows, and the small porch had already been torn away. There was no sign of Hannah. "She must have gone to the town hall," Thaddeus reassured Clara, hoping he spoke the truth. As they watched, a section of the cottage's roof collapsed. Unable to withstand the battering of the storm, Clara made a small sound of distress. "All the way uphill now," Thaddeus said, pointing to where lights from the town hall could be seen in the distance. "No more stopping. This final stretch would be the most dangerous, an open ascent with little protection from the powerful current still flowing downhill." Thaddeus checked Clara's rope harness one more time, then lifted her to sit on his shoulders. "Hold on to my head if you need to," he instructed. "Don't worry about hurting me." With Clara secure, Thaddeus began the arduous journey uphill. The water level gradually decreased as they ascended, but the current remained treacherous. Twice he nearly lost his footing on submerged debris, but each time he recovered, his determination never wavering. Other townspeople were making the same journey, families clinging together, neighbors helping the elderly. When they saw the giant pirate with Clara safely on his shoulders, many stared in disbelief. Halfway up the hill, they encountered a search party coming down. Samuel Porter, Reverend Collins, and two other men carrying lanterns. "Clara," Reverend Collins called out in relief. "Thank the Lord." "Her mother?" Thaddeus asked urgently. "Safe at the town hall," Porter assured him, frantic with worry, "but safe." For the first time since the storm began, Thaddeus felt something loosen in his chest. Together the group continued uphill, the lights of the town hall growing brighter with each step. On his shoulders, Clara leaned down to speak close to his ear. "Thank you for finding me," she said simply. "Thank you for trying to warn me," he replied. "But next time, stay with your mother." Clara's small hand patted his wet beard. "Next time," she agreed solemnly. The town hall of Port Bramble had never held so many people at once. Families huddled together on blankets spread across the wooden floor. Children dozed fitfully, while adults spoke in hushed tones. The large stone fireplace burned steadily, providing both light and warmth to those gathered closest to it. Hannah Marshall paced near the entrance, pausing at each gust of wind to stare anxiously at the doors. When they finally swung open to admit the search party, She rushed forward with a cry. "Clara!" Thaddeus carefully lifted the girl from his shoulders and set her on her feet. Clara ran to her mother's embrace, both of them trembling with emotion. "I'm sorry, Mother," Clara whispered. "I wanted to warn the captain about the wall breaking." Hannah looked past her daughter to Thaddeus, who stood dripping on the threshold, his massive frame seeming even larger against the backdrop of the storm outside. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "I can never repay." "No need," Thaddeus interrupted gently. "She's a brave girl." The doors closed behind the last of the search party, and an awkward silence fell as the gathered townspeople regarded the giant pirate in their midst. His clothes were torn and muddy, his beard plastered to his chest, yet he stood tall and dignified despite his bedraggled appearance. Mayor Wilson stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Captain Blackthorne, on behalf of Port Bramble, I thank you for your assistance tonight. Your efforts have saved lives." Thaddeus nodded once in acknowledgement, then moved to a corner away from the main gathering, aware of the discomfort his presence caused many. He sat with his back against the wall, his long legs stretched before him, and began methodically checking his rope for damage. Clara, after a few minutes in her mother's arms, pulled away. "Captain Thaddeus is all alone," she observed, "and he's very wet." Hannah hesitated, then nodded. "Let's bring him a blanket and some hot tea." As mother and daughter approached, Thaddeus looked up in surprise. Hannah offered a woolen blanket, while Clara held out a steaming cup. "You must be cold," Hannah said, "and hungry too, I expect." "I've weathered worse," Thaddeus replied, though he accepted both blanket and tea with a nod of thanks. "May we sit with you?" Clara asked, not waiting for an answer before plopping down beside him. After a moment's hesitation, Hannah joined them. Across the room, the gesture did not go unnoticed. Mrs. Finch, reunited with her son Thomas, who had made it safely to the town hall, watched with a troubled expression. "The Marshall girl seems quite attached to him," she remarked to Mrs. Porter. "He did save her life," Mrs. Porter replied reasonably. "And Thomas speaks well of him too. Says the captain told him exactly how to get to safety before rushing off to find Clara." Gradually, as the night progressed and the storm continued to rage outside, small changes occurred in the great room of the town hall. Thomas Finch, clutching his rescued cat, approached Thaddeus cautiously to thank him. James Porter followed, curious about the sailor's adventures. One by one, children gathered around the giant pirate, who, with gentle prompting from Clara, began telling quiet stories to distract them from the frightening sounds outside. Parents, at first alarmed, soon realized the benefit of having their frightened children calmed and entertained. They listened from a distance as Thaddeus described distant lands and strange creatures in his deep, soothing voice. "He's quite good with them," Dr. Adams observed to Reverend Collins. "Not at all what one would expect. Perhaps we've been too quick to judge," the Reverend replied thoughtfully. As midnight approached, Mayor Wilson called the adults together to discuss their situation. "The storm shows no sign of abating," he reported grimly, "and we're running low on firewood. Food and water should last until morning, but if we're stranded longer, I can take a party to check my shop," Samuel Porter offered. "The forge will still be dry, it's on higher ground, and I have tools we might need." "Too dangerous in the dark," Thaddeus commented from his corner, where he still sat surrounded by now sleeping children. "Wait for first light." The mayor looked to the window where rain still lashed against the glass. "And what of those who might be trapped elsewhere? The Johnsons live on the north side. They never arrived. We can organize search parties at dawn," Thaddeus suggested. 3 men per group, each with rope and a lantern. The mayor nodded slowly. "You have experience with such matters." "I've weathered 17 major storms at sea," Thaddeus replied. "Lost men in 12 of them. I'd prefer not to lose any tonight." An understanding passed between the 2 men, a grudging respect from the mayor, a willingness to serve from Thaddeus. As the night wore on, The adults took turns keeping watch while others tried to rest. Clara slept peacefully against Thaddeus's side, wrapped in a blanket, her face relaxed in the firelight. Hannah sat nearby, watching her daughter with a mixture of relief and wonder. "She's never taken to anyone like this," she said quietly to Thaddeus. "Not since her father died." "Children see differently than adults," Thaddeus replied, less clouded by judgment. Hannah studied him in the flickering light. "I'm beginning to think they see more clearly than we do." First light crept through the windows of the town hall, grey and tentative. The storm had finally passed, though rain still fell in a gentle patter against the glass. Inside, most of Port Bramble's residents slept in exhausted heaps, families curled together for warmth and comfort. Thaddeus was already awake, had been for hours, moving quietly among the sleeping townspeople, checking the structural integrity of their shelter, monitoring the water level visible through the windows. Now he stood by the main doors, waiting for enough light to begin the day's work. Mayor Wilson joined him, looking haggard after the sleepless night. "What do you see?" "Water's receded about 2 feet since high tide," Thaddeus replied. "Still dangerous, but passable in most areas with proper precaution." The mayor nodded, rubbing his face wearily. "We should organize teams to assess damage and search for anyone still missing." "I've made a list," Thaddeus said, producing a piece of paper with neat handwriting. 3 teams, specific routes, supply requirements for each. Mayor Wilson took the list, raising his eyebrows slightly at the thoroughness. "You've done this before. After every storm at sea comes the reckoning," Thaddeus said quietly. "Best to face it methodically." As the sun rose higher, more townspeople awakened. The initial disorientation quickly gave way to concern about homes and livelihoods. Samuel Porter organized a group of men to accompany him to the forge for tools. Reverend Collins prepared to check on the church. Dr. Adams gathered what few medical supplies were available, anticipating injuries. Clara tugged at Thaddeus's hand as he prepared to join the first assessment team. "Can I come with you?" "Not this time," he said gently. "There will be dangers, unstable buildings, debris in the water." Hannah approached, overhearing the exchange. "Captain Blackthorne is right, Clara. You'll stay here and help organize supplies with me." Clara looked disappointed, but nodded bravely. "Will you at least check if my wooden ship washed up somewhere?" Thaddeus smiled beneath his beard. "I'll keep an eye out for it." The assessment teams departed, wading carefully through water that still reached mid-calf in places. As they rounded the bend that would give them their first clear view of the harbor and lower town, a collective gasp rose from the men. Devastation stretched before them. The harbor wall was largely gone, reduced to scattered stones. Of the 24 boats that had been moored there, only a handful remained, listing at odd angles or beached on what had once been streets. Houses nearest the water were simply gone, while others stood damaged but recognizable, their doors torn away and windows shattered. "Mother of God," whispered Reverend Collins. Mayor Wilson's face was ashen. "Our town." Thaddeus stepped forward, his expression grave but determined. "Your town still stands, Mayor. Buildings can be rebuilt. Boats can be replaced. You didn't lose a single life last night. That's what matters." The mayor straightened his shoulders slightly. "You're right, of course. Where do we begin?" "Salvage what can be saved," Thaddeus replied, already moving toward the nearest damaged structure. "Clear debris from the main pathways. Establish a temporary harbor further west where the remaining boats can be secured." The men dispersed to their assigned tasks, and for several hours they worked in relative silence, the enormity of the destruction dampening conversation. Thaddeus moved from site to site, his strength proving invaluable in shifting heavy debris. Where others might have faltered in the face of such devastation, he worked steadily, methodically, with the certainty of one who had rebuilt after destruction before. By midday, residents began emerging from the town hall to see the damage for themselves. Cries of dismay mingled with expressions of gratitude that the losses were primarily material. Hannah and Clara joined those assessing what remained of their cottage. The roof's mostly gone, Hannah said softly, staring at the sodden remnants of their home. And the walls won't be far behind. Clara surveyed the damage with surprising composure. But we're all right, she said, echoing Thaddeus's earlier sentiment. And we can build again. Nearby, Mrs. Finch stared in shock at the ruins of her bakery, the pride of Port Bramble's main street for 15 years. The stone oven remained, but little else was recognizable. Everything's gone, she whispered, clutching her son's hand. All my work, Thaddeus, passing with an armful of salvaged timber, paused. The oven's intact, he observed, and there's flour in the town hall stores. You could have bread for the town by tomorrow. Mrs. Finch looked startled, both by his direct address and by the practical suggestion. After a moment, she nodded slowly. I suppose I could. People will be hungry. Throughout the afternoon, similar scenes unfolded across Port Bramble. Grief and shock gradually gave way to determination. Neighbors helped neighbors sort through belongings, salvage tools, rescue keepsakes. Children were set to collecting undamaged items that could be reused. Nails, hinges, unbroken glass. As the sun began its descent, Thaddeus stood at what remained of the harbor wall, studying the damage with a practiced eye. The mayor found him there, sketching rough plans in the mud with a stick. The council will meet tonight, Mayor Wilson said without preamble. To discuss rebuilding, your input would be valuable. Thaddeus looked up, genuine surprise crossing his weathered features. I'd be honored to attend, Mayor. The week following the storm transformed Port Bramble in ways no one could have anticipated. What began as desperate cleanup efforts evolved into an organized rebuilding campaign, with teams assigned to specific tasks. At the center of it all, surprising everyone including himself, stood Thaddeus Blackthorne. The evening after the storm, the town council meeting had stretched long into the night. Initially awkward, Thaddeus hunched on a chair too small for his frame, while council members watched him warily. The atmosphere had changed when he unrolled detailed sketches of proposed harbor improvements. The original wall was built for smaller surges, he'd explained, pointing to his drawings. If we rebuild with a northeastern breakwater here and reinforce this section with a different angle, it would withstand similar storms in the future. His knowledge of tides, currents, and naval architecture had been undeniable. When he finished speaking, the council had voted unanimously to appoint him coordinator of the harbor reconstruction. Now, a large board stood in the town square, salvaged from the schoolhouse door. On it, daily tasks were posted, teams assigned, and progress tracked. Each morning, townspeople gathered to receive their assignments, increasingly comfortable taking direction from the giant pirate they had once feared. Porter's team to continue forge work, priority on nails and hinges, Thaddeus called out, checking his list. Jenkins and Collins groups to the eastern shoreline for lumber recovery. Marshall team to coordinate food distribution. Hannah, standing with Clara near the front of the crowd, nodded at their assignment. With their cottage uninhabitable, they had moved temporarily into Reverend Collins' small guest room, but spent most daylight hours helping wherever needed. Green team to continue salvage diving at low tide, Thaddeus continued. Remember, safety lines required at all times. The task assignments complete, teams dispersed to their work areas. Clara lingered, looking up at Thaddeus. Still no sign of my ship, she asked, hopefully. His expression softened. Not yet, little one, but the sea often returns what it takes, in time. Hannah touched her daughter's shoulder gently. Come along, Clara. The captain has work to do. Thaddeus watched them go, then turned his attention to the harbor, where the largest reconstruction effort was underway. Stones from the original wall were being recovered from the seabed, supplemented with new materials hauled from the quarry 3 miles inland. Men who had once crossed the street to avoid Thaddeus now worked alongside him, learning to anticipate his needs from brief gestures or nods. The northeast corner needs reinforcement, Samuel Porter observed, wiping sweat from his brow as he joined Thaddeus on the temporary pier. Agreed, Thaddeus replied. I've drafted a new angled support. Your forge team could fashion the metal braces. Porter nodded, examining the sketch Thaddeus offered. Unusual design. Saw something similar in Singapore, Thaddeus explained. Harbor there faces similar surge patterns. Singapore, Porter repeated, shaking his head slightly. Sometimes I forget how much of the world you've seen. The blacksmith hesitated, then added gruffly, My boy James keeps asking for more of your stories. Says you promised to tell him about the dolphins that rescued a drowning sailor. Thaddeus looked surprised. I didn't think he'd remember that. Children remember more than we give them credit for, Porter replied. Perhaps, when there's time, you might finish the story for him. It was the closest thing to a social invitation Thaddeus had received in his 3 years in Port Bramble. I'd be honored, he said simply. As the days passed, such interactions became more frequent. Miss Finch, her bakery oven repaired under Thaddeus's direction, brought him fresh bread each morning. To keep your strength up, she insisted, though they both recognized the gesture as the peace offering it was. Adams sought his advice on treating minor injuries with limited medical supplies, discovering that Thaddeus's years at sea had taught him effective remedies for everything from rope burns to saltwater infections. The school teacher, Miss Winters, enlisted his help rebuilding desks, finding that his careful hands could fashion sturdy furniture from salvaged wood. Each small interaction healed more than the physical damage to Port Bramble. Old prejudices weakened in the face of shared purpose. Fear gave way to respect, then gradually to appreciation. Clara watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. Each evening, in the Reverend's small parlor, she added to her sketchbook images of Thaddeus directing reconstruction efforts, teaching fishing techniques, showing younger children how to tie sailors' knots. He's different now, Hannah observed, glancing at her daughter's latest drawing. Clara shook her head. He's not different. Everyone else is just seeing him properly now. 10 days after the storm, Mayor Wilson called a special town meeting. The community gathered in the repaired town hall, sitting on benches hastily constructed from salvaged lumber. Port Bramble has faced its greatest challenge in living memory, the mayor began, and has emerged stronger for it, thanks in large part to the leadership and expertise of Captain Thaddeus Blackthorne. All eyes turned to Thaddeus, who stood uncomfortably at the back of the room, unused to public recognition. The council proposes, the mayor continued, that Captain Blackthorne be officially appointed Harbour Master of Port Bramble, with all rights and responsibilities thereof. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Old Mr. Parsons, the previous harbour master, whose predictions had proven so catastrophically wrong, nodded grudgingly from his seat in the front row. Clara, sitting between her mother and Reverend Collins, beamed with pride. When no one was looking, she slipped her small hand into her pocket, where she kept the smooth conch shell Thaddeus had given her, a token of a friendship that had transformed not just 2 lives, but an entire community. 3 weeks after the storm, Port Bramble had risen anew. The harbour wall stood stronger than before, its innovative design already tested by 2 smaller squalls. Most homes had been repaired or rebuilt, shops had reopened, and fishing boats once again dotted the horizon each morning. The day dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of fresh bread from Mrs. Finch's newly restored bakery. Throughout town, people bustled about with unusual purpose, carrying baskets covered with cloths, arranging flowers, and hanging colorful banners between lampposts. In his cottage, which had suffered minimal damage due to its sturdy construction and higher ground, Thaddeus carefully folded his new harbour master's coat over a chair. The navy wool with brass buttons had been a gift from the town council, presented with ceremony the previous day. He ran his fingers over the official embroidery on the pocket, an anchor surrounded by the words Port Bramble Harbour Master. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Opening it, he found Clara standing there, practically bouncing with excitement. "You're needed in town right away," she announced importantly. "Is there a problem?" he asked, immediately alert. "Not a problem," Clara assured him, "but you have to come now, And wear your new coat." Mystified but obedient, Thaddeus donned the coat and followed Clara down the path toward town. As they approached the square, he noticed the streets were strangely empty for mid-morning. "Where is everyone?" he asked. Clara just smiled mysteriously and took his hand, leading him toward the harbor front. As they rounded the corner, Thaddeus stopped in his tracks, momentarily stunned by the sight before him. The entire population of Port Bramble seemed to be gathered at the harbor. Tables had been arranged in a great U-shape along the new seawall, covered with white cloths and laden with food. Banners stretched overhead declaring Port Bramble Restoration Celebration. Children darted about, laughing and playing. Adults stood in conversational clusters, all turned expectantly toward him as he appeared with Clara. "Surprise!" she cried, squeezing his hand. Mayor Wilson stepped forward, smiling broadly. "Captain Blackthorne, we invited you to a celebration of Port Bramble's restoration. What we didn't tell you is that you're the guest of honor." Thaddeus felt heat rise to his face, unaccustomed to such attention. "This isn't necessary," he began. "Oh, but it is," the mayor insisted. "Some celebrations are not just deserved, but needed. Please join us at the head table." Clara tugged him forward, and Thaddeus found himself guided to the center of the U-shaped arrangement, where a chair larger than the others had been placed, specially built to accommodate his frame. On either side sat places for the town council members, and directly across from him, seats for Clara and Hannah. Once everyone was seated, Mayor Wilson rose to offer a toast. "To Port Bramble," he began, raising his glass. "Stronger now than ever before." "To Port Bramble," the crowd echoed, "and to Captain Thaddeus Blackthorne," the mayor continued, turning to face Thaddeus directly. "Who taught us that a person's worth is measured not by rumors or appearances, but by actions and heart. We were blind, Captain, but the storm washed the scales from our eyes." A chorus of "Hear, hear" rose from the gathering. Thaddeus, deeply uncomfortable with the praise but touched beyond words, nodded acknowledgement. As the feast began, he found himself engaged in conversation from all sides, genuine questions about his travels, his shipbuilding knowledge, his plans for further harbor improvements. No one mentioned his pirate past. It seemed to have receded in importance, like the floodwaters themselves. Midway through the meal, Clara slipped away from her mother's side, returning moments later with a small group of children. They approached Thaddeus shyly, carrying something hidden behind their backs. "We have a present for you," Clara announced, nodding to her companions. Together they revealed their gift. Clara's wooden ship, miraculously recovered, meticulously restored, and newly decorated with tiny flags made from scraps of colorful cloth. "We found it caught in the bell tower," Thomas Finch explained, "and we all helped fix it," added James Porter proudly. "It's still your birthday present," Clara said, "but we thought maybe you could keep it at your cottage so we'd have something special to play with when we visit you for stories." Thaddeus accepted the ship with hands that trembled slightly. "This is," he began, then had to clear his throat before continuing. "This is the finest gift I've ever received." As the celebration continued into afternoon, Thaddeus found moments to speak with nearly everyone in Port Bramble. People who had once crossed the street to avoid him now sought his company, his advice, his stories. Even Finch, once his most vocal critic, asked earnestly about his favorite type of bread so she could keep the harbor master properly fed. When evening approached and lanterns were lit around the harbor, Mayor Wilson called for attention once more. "Before we conclude our celebration," he announced, "the children of Port Bramble have prepared something special." The gathered children, led by Clara, formed a semicircle and began to sing a traditional sea shanty, one Thaddeus had often hummed to himself on lonely evenings at the pier. Their sweet voices carried clearly in the evening air, and when they reached the chorus, they gestured for the adults to join in. Gradually, the entire town was singing together, their voices blending in harmony. Thaddeus remained silent at first, overwhelmed by emotion, but when Clara caught his eye and smiled encouragingly, He added his deep baritone to the chorus. As the last notes faded into the gentle lapping of waves against the new harbor wall, Thaddeus looked around at the faces illuminated by lantern light, no longer strangers or adversaries, but neighbors, perhaps even friends. Hannah approached as people began gathering their belongings, Clara sleepy by her side. "You'll come for dinner tomorrow?" she asked, the invitation offered as naturally as if it were a long-established tradition. "I'd be honored," Thaddeus replied simply. Later, as he walked back to his cottage beneath a canopy of stars, Thaddeus reflected that he had sailed the 7 seas, visited exotic ports, and commanded crews of dozens, but never before had he found what Port Bramble now offered him a place to belong.